Although I served on this committee last Congress, I'm excited to bring much-needed accountability to Washington for the first time in over 2 years. My Republican colleagues and I are committed to returning this committee to its proper role of rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement in the federal government, and that commitment starts today. In the span of 1 year, Congress passed upwards of $4.6 trillion in the form of economic stimulus bills and expanded eligibility for federal relief programs like unemployment insurance. When communities across America started to recover from the pandemic, Congress continued to saturate states with millions of taxpayer dollars under the guise of COVID-19 relief without the means to distribute it efficiently or safely. A Kansas audit showed that my home state may have made hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent payments when state agency systems were overwhelmed by an unprecedented number of claimants. As recently as last September, the Department of Justice charged 47 people with using the Federal Child Nutrition Program in Minnesota to siphon $250 million. And it's no secret that many states abuse these funds to alter school curriculum, give illegal immigrants stimulus checks, and advance green energy initiatives. Public trust in our government is an all-time low, and we cannot expect that to change if we continue this poor stewardship of Americans' tax dollars. I think Congress can do better, and I look forward to discussing with our witnesses how to avoid this level of fraud and waste of taxpayer dollars in the future. Mr. Dodaro, and I'll ask the same question of the other two witnesses. Your institution is tasked with monitoring administrative agencies and providing recommendations for improvement. Per GAO's website and the testimony we've heard, fraud detection is a difficult task. Can GAO ascribe a monetary cost to conducting fraud detection and retroactive certification of payments? If not, can you describe the potential opportunity cost to the taxpayer of directing agency attention toward auditing massive COVID payments after they're distributed?
It's much more efficient to prevent the fraud from occurring in the first place. That's why we worked with Congress back in 2015, 2016 to pass the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act, to put in place a framework that we developed for best practices on how to prevent fraud in the first place. Much more efficient, much more effective.
Mr. Horowitz?
Yes, I'd say the same thing. We talked about this earlier about the recovery rate when the money's already gone and you have to chase it down. It's a 10, 12% rate, I think Mr. Dodaro indicated. Keep in mind, money, for example, that goes overseas takes a long time to try and track that down if you ever can. And so that's the challenge. There is no better way to eliminate or reduce fraud rates than to detect it and prevent it at the outset.
Mr. Smith, the winner of the easiest name award on the panel today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's.
I agree with my colleagues. The Secret Service, prior to the pandemic, is in the business of mitigating financial crimes and fraud. I mentioned earlier that that's in our DNA, if you will. We do advanced work because we know criminals are nonstop in their efforts in trying to defraud Americans, whether before the pandemic or not.
Let's stay with you. You worked with government entities like the Small Business Administration, the Department of Labor, ahead of the enactment of the pandemic relief funding to explore strategies to address what you describe as a, quote, a looming wave of potentially fraudulent activity. Drawing from your experience tracking fraud in federal relief programs, what could the government have done to better support states and entities in charge of dispersing funds?
What could we have done to support the states?
Correct.
So one of the things I mentioned earlier was putting out alerts. So our cyber fraud task forces and our Global Investigative Operations Center, which is the hub of all of our task forces, submitted alerts, GIOC alerts, if you will, to 30,000 plus financial institutions and to those partners. What we were doing was sharing indicators of compromise with those entities, such as if an individual was using an IP address that was from an overseas originating point, or if a financial institution saw, if you happen to see an account being opened fairly recently and that account was being used to move a substantial amount of money in a short period of time, that will be something you would flag. So one of the things we did at the beginning of the pandemic and even prior was sharing information and indicators of compromise that we're seeing not only from other entities, but from criminals themselves, because keep in mind, as a federal law enforcement entity, we do work with criminals. We have confidential informants, and we get information from the inside, if you will, regarding what tactics are afoot.
Thank you. And the committee thanks all three of you for being here today and doing a great job answering questions. At this time, we're going to pause and change out the panels.